Virginia, and the selection this week for our history feature. Author Donald McCaig incorporates historic people and events into the book. And in July, he spoke at Politics and Prose bookstore in Washington, D.C., about his research and how he wrapped the fictional story around actual events.
On behalf of Barbara Mead and Carla Cohen, co-owners of Politics and Prose, I want to welcome everyone here tonight to hear Donald McCaig read from Jacob's Ladder, and then Mr. McCaig will answer questions. We'll probably wrap things up about 8 o'clock. I read this book over the past week, and I got to say I enjoyed it a whole lot. There's always more and more fiction and nonfiction being written about the Civil War. This book really stood out. It's got a nice sized cast of characters from all sorts of walks of life whose lives continue to intersect with one another's in ways that I wasn't able to predict, and ways that brought out the human tragedy of, slavery or war, and when two massive forces collide against one another. We've got a lot of other nice readings coming in July, and I recommend everyone come check those out too. Richard Holbrook's going to be here, and Clay Lewis and John Lewis and Ron Susskind and some other neat things. But without further ado, we'll begin with Donald McCaig.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming out on a, was it Wednesday night? Middle of the week, anyway. Sort of the middle of the week, yeah. What my generous introducer didn't mention is that there's entirely too many characters in this book. It's just one of its flaws. There's too many words in it, too, by and large, although I couldn't get rid of any more than I did. This particular book was an obsession, which is an unfortunate thing to do. It's not, you don't become very pleasant or nicer to your fellow man when you're obsessed. I was near the, this took me 6 years, and near the end of it, I was waking up in the middle of the night, and I had this little notepad by my side. Now, this was not to capture bits of wisdom. It was because whatever I would write down usually would be some nonsense. But once I'd written it down, I could go back to sleep, you see. So that was my strategy with it. It all started a long time ago. I was researching for another book, and in the county courthouse, I ran into a court case which seemed a little unusual. There was I live in the mountains of Virginia, and although slavery was quite common, the number of slaves wasn't as great as it was in the Tidewater. The largest slave owner in that part of Virginia was a fellow by the name of Samuel Gatewood. He owned 28 slaves, and one winter, the winter of 1860-61, one of the slaves ran away, a young fellow by the name of Jesse. In the spring, he was found by the slave patrollers at a sort of a rundown cabin owned by a young couple whose names were not a county name. Now, when the slave patrollers came and knocked on the door, the young couple should rather sensibly have said, "Oh, my goodness, we thought he was a freed black," or, "Gee, we sort of lost our heads there for a minute." Instead, they were defiant. And when the patrollers asked Jesse, they said, "Jesse, are you going to run again?" Now, the correct answer to that question is, "Oh, no, massa, I have learned my lesson." Jesse said, "It's a mighty big mountain up there." Now, the young couple were tried for felony because Jesse was another man's property, and very valuable property he was. The trial was held after Fort Sumter was invested by South Carolina militia, but before it was actually fired upon. This was a time of great goofiness in the South. There were torchlight parades at night. Militias were forming. Women were sewing regimental flags and bits of uniforms. Everybody was just entirely cranked up. The judge found the young couple guilty of felony and sentenced them to 5 years in the Virginia State Penitentiary, which at that time was a unisex penitentiary in Richmond. At which point they all disappeared from the records. That was it. Jesse, of course, being a slave, barely existed in the records. He was a piece of property to be bought and sold. And the Kirkpatricks, the young couple, most of the penitentiary records were lost in a fire. So I started wondering what had happened to all these people. Now, the very early part of the war, like the very end part of the war, occurred around Richmond. The first major offensive in the war was McClellan's marching up the peninsula towards Richmond. And I wondered what it would have been like to be in the penitentiary there as people who were in there for harboring a runaway slave. While that happened, and of course I wondered what happened to Jesse. I mean, one of the things that was true was that there was probably a good deal less slave beating than people think. They think that the whip came out at the earliest opportunity. Well, the reason it didn't wasn't the milk of human kindness. It was simply that if you beat a slave, then the mark showed, and the next person that might want to buy him would know that this was a difficult slave, and the price would drop. But what they were quite capable of doing was selling recalcitrant slaves south, and did so quite regularly. Well, what happened to Jesse? The war itself was the biggest single change in the fortunes of African Americans since they were enslaved in Africa. It was a monumental change, and they perfectly well knew it. The federal troops, by and large, thought they were fighting to preserve the Union. The Confederates, by and large, thought that what they were doing was trying to form a new nation on the model of the republic their grandfathers had formed. The only people who had a very clear 20th century picture of what that war was about were the slaves themselves, and they knew perfectly well it was about whether or not they'd continue to be slaves or not. It changed us all. It was the war that made us what we are today, in some ways for right and in some ways probably for wrong. One of the kind of incidental things that happened during the war, this book, because it has all these characters running around, goes off the battlefield often and to places that normally are not visited by writers. The book takes an entire plantation through the war. You will find nothing of strategy in this, although Robert E. Lee is a figure. You will know nothing more about him than you knew before. This is a view from the underside, if you will. What I was interested in finding out was how it would have felt to be there. Not what the great leaders thought, but what the people who were there thought at the time. And to do this, I went as much as possible to the soldiers' letters, the letters that survive from the matrons, the nurses in the hospitals, in some cases memoirs, journals, and diaries. During the war, Richmond was the largest and probably best hospital in the world. At one point, there were 70,000 patients in the Richmond hospitals. Now, one of the reasons that they were very good hospitals, in fact, their mortality rate was not lowered until the First World War, was kind of accidental. It was common practice in the Union armies to, if a man died of an infected wound, they just take the bandages and slosh some cold water on him and use them on the next fella. They didn't understand antiseptic procedures at that time. The Confederates were too poor to buy bandages or to have bandages, and so for the most part what they used for wound dressings was lint, which the kindly ladies of the Confederacy would sit around in the afternoon and pluck out of their old undergarments and put in great bags and send off to the hospitals. And of course, that couldn't be reused. And as a consequence, probably that's one of the reasons for the relatively low mortality rate. One of the other things that happened was that before the war in the United States, women were not nurses. The reason was because everybody sort of felt, all the men felt anyway, that it was not respectable work. It was sort of not a good idea, they thought, for unchaperoned women to be in the company of so many men. However, the women who helped with the wounded in Richmond soon moved over into positions that they called matrons. They became regular nurses by the end of the war. And they were so useful to the surgeons that the issue was simply decided. The surgeons would hear nothing about we weren't going to have any more matrons. This particular short chapter is called Too Common Coin, and it occurs the days after one of the great Confederate victories at Fredericksburg. And it takes place in Richmond and at Camp Winder, which was one of the early hospitals in Richmond, on December 14th, 1862. Every night before retiring, Sally Botkin Kirkpatrick prayed for bad weather. In deep snow, or when freezing and thawing make the roads impassable, armies do not fight, and men do not maim one another. It had been not quite 3 months since the carnage at Sharpsburg, and the weary surgeons and matrons of Camp Winder Hospital were beginning to hope that the flood of desperately wounded men had ebbed until spring. Jammed with wounded, puffing, dense, stinking wood smoke, the first trains rolled down Broad Street shortly after midnight. The red brick depot of the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad was lit by flaring gaslight. Its broad platform overflowed with people. Ambulances from all the Richmond hospitals waited at the curb. Swaddled in a heavy blanket, Sally sat beside a convalescent, Major Spinagle, while the train's engineer banged his bell and screeched his wheel brakes, and then there was that heartbreaking dead silence before people rushed towards the cars like an exhalation of breath. "Come, Major," Sally said. Owing to his cheerfulness, the Major was a great favorite among the matrons. The Major had suffered his wound at Sharpsburg, and though his leg had been amputated above the knee, he took his loss in good spirits. According to him, his family had been the last Unionists in his South Carolina county and had suffered opprobrium for their views. "But I have the laugh on my neighbors now," he said. "I have confuted all their arguments. For the rest of my life, I am branded patriot." "You know what we are to do?" Sally now asked. "We are to assume St. Peter's Post, separate the quick from the dead. Although I am capable of ordering boys into galling fire, I defer to you tonight. Some of my sex assert that women are the weaker vessel. Major, you are too clever for me." His smiling face fell. "I am sorry. I was just joking to quiet my nerves. Why is it that men are so eager to make messes they cannot clean up afterward?" Supporting one another, wounded men tottered out of the cars, while behind, its locomotive belching cinders, another train waited impatiently. Lightly wounded men and civilians rolled men onto litters. Dead men, faces uncovered, formed melancholy ranks against the depot wall. Elderly men, boys, and respectable matrons sought news of their loved ones. Some carried pails of cool water, and one pretty girl had a basket of the ripest, reddest apples. Ambulances clattered on the cobblestones. Steam engines chuffed importantly. With a cry no louder than a kitten's mewl, a new widow fainted. "Careful with that officer, damn you. Can you walk to the ambulance? Please do lean against me." "No, ma'am. I've no news of the 4th Georgia. Our regiment was at Marie's Heights." Wounded Federal prisoners were cared for without distinction, and privates were loaded as quickly as officers. When one locomotive removed its reeking cars, another took its place. Some of the ambulances were two-wheel carts, some were farm wagons. The best had been captured from the Federals. "My name is Daniel McClintock. Please write my father that I did my duty and look forward to seeing Jesus," one boy told Sally. His wound, a tiny puncture in his chest, hadn't bled much. His dirty uniform was hardly blood-stained. "God bless you, ma'am," he said, and died. The ambulance men shifted hopeless cases to the far end of the platform, where volunteer chaplains offered what comfort they could. The station tower clock struck 3. The major conscripted militiamen to control the crowd. Ambulances must have room to pass, he cried. Please. Most of the faces were young. Some were chalk white with approaching death, others smeared with dirt and blood. Will I live, ma'am? Yes, yes. We will tend you. At Sally's direction, men were loaded on ambulances or carried to the end of the platform. She forwarded all the youngest boys to Winder, no matter how badly wounded, because she could not bear to give up hope for them. The dawn was mild and beautiful, the sky a benefaction. Sally swished her bloody hands in a water bucket. Another train was pulling in. On their return to the hospital, a wounded boy moaned whenever the ambulance bumped. The major said, I am told General Lee anticipates the Federals will renew their assault this morning. Perhaps General Lee will care for the new wounded, Sally snapped. God knows we are overwhelmed. There is no more room at Howard's or Liggins, and they are laying boys on the floor at Mayo's warehouse. Our poor boys. Bravery is too common coin. The major said, Surgeon Lane's son is with Cobb's North Carolinians. I understood they took the brunt of yesterday's assault. In the still air, smoke from Winder's morning fires formed a pall over the whitewashed ward buildings. In Sally's ward, men lay on either side of a wide center aisle. The summer netting was rolled up and tied, and pot-bellied stoves glowed red. Young Jimmy perched at the foot of his cot, mending one sock. How are you feeling today, Jimmy? The boy had seen just one day of war at South Mountain before Canister took off his leg. He'd soon be furloughed home. Oh, Miss Sally, I am raring to go. I can hobble around on this stick just as good as if I had two legs. But sometimes, first thing in the morning, when it's especially damp, I swear I can still feel that old leg, just like I still had it. Sally nodded. Others have made the same report, Jimmy. The boy furrowed his brow. Miss Sally, could I ask you? I don't mean to be impertinent. I just thought that since I was going home soon, I could ask you. I don't know another woman I might ask. The boy looked straight up at the ceiling and kept his eyes fixed there. It ain't just me wondering. It's every man who lost an arm or a leg. We was wondering. When Sally put her palm to his forehead, it was cool. We was wondering if a decent girl would ever want to take up with us, he hurried on. Corporal Rexroad says women won't have no choice, that every man in the South will have been shot up. But that Irishman, Ryan, he says a woman doesn't need a man so bad as a man needs a woman. And if they got to pick one of us, they won't pick at all. Please, Miss Sally, he searched her eyes. Could such a one as you care for such a one as me? Convalescents brought a breakfast of bread baked at the hospital, a cup full of brown beans, fresh milk, an apple, and a hard-boiled egg. Sally drank a glass of milk. Miss Sally, the major said, we're required again at the trains. Sally took time to splash cold water on her face. It was such a beautiful, bright winter's day they might have been on a pleasure jaunt, had not their ambulance stunk so. The trains were backed up to Henry Street, 12 blocks from the RF&P depot. There were more young women at the scene than earlier. Otherwise, things were much the same. The major directed ambulances to the platform, and Sally filled them. Sometime after 4 o'clock, one of the colored ambulance drivers called out, Miss Sally, Surgeon Lane don't want you sending no more. We're full up. Then we should forward them to Chimborazo. Chimborazo full pretty quick, too, Miss Sally. Then inform Miss Semple we must release our convalescing patients to those private homes that will accommodate them. Matron Semple will make arrangements. Come, Sally, the major said kindly, you must take some nourishment. When Sally wiped her hands on her dress, she left streaks of blood. Soup. Some soup would be nice. The public rooms of the Spotswood Hotel were packed with men drinking, some to the victory, some to the death toll. One gray-faced elderly man sat on the stairs, sobbing into his hands. Before the war, the Spotswood had been Richmond's most fashionable hostelry. Important planters and visiting dignitaries called it their Richmond residence. French wallpaper still adorned the walls, and chandeliers, no longer glistening, still hung overhead. But the tables had been pushed together into long rows. The manager collected his $20, Confederate, at the door, and luncheon consisted of potato soup and cornbread. The clamor was Babylonian, conversation nearly impossible. The man on the bench beside Sally wore a cavalryman's uniform and smelled like horse sweat and fresh manure. The backs of Sally's hands were blood-spattered. The crosspiece of the major's crutch, a smooth length of curved hickory padded with cloth, was propped against the table. The soup was light on potato content, but satisfactory as to broth, and the cornbread was hot and filling. The room raised 3 cheers for General Lee. What had life been like before this war? Unable to talk over those who were cheering Stonewall Jackson and intending to work through the entire Confederate command, Sally and the Major went back to work. The last train emptied at dusk, nearly 5 o'clock, and when Sally and the Major left for Winder, the only men on the station platform were dead or dying. Camp Winder's 3 surgeons had been cutting since yesterday midnight. Unlike smoothbore musket balls, which broke bones, the new mini ball shattered them. Sometimes when the ball struck softer bone near the joint, salvage was possible. Usually, even when flesh and muscles were relatively intact, the bone was splintered and the shattered limb had to be amputated. Most surgery was amputations, and almost all successful surgery was. Convalescents carried a patient into the ward, and on his litter what could be done was. The cloth, saturating with chloroform, was clapped over the patient's dirty face. The affected limb was stripped of clothing and washed. The surgeon's knife slashed quickly and completely through muscles, exposing the bone before the fine-toothed saw went to work. As the surgeon cut, a matron kept the tourniquet tight so the man wouldn't bleed to death. In the pool of light, the patient, a middle-aged Irish corporal, said, "And it is sorry I am to be meeting you under these circumstances. Can I keep my hand?" A weary Surgeon Lane shook his head, no. "Well, that'll be all right then. Me mother warned me about pinching the girls. Religious she was." Underneath the stink of blood was the stink of men's sweat and urine and feces, and the faintest tang of gunpowder. Men were brought to cots, laid on the floors between cots, and finally in the aisles. Cousin Molly came in and touched Surgeon Lane's shoulder. The paper she held out to him was a telegram. Surgeon Lane made no sound, but he went white, and tears leaked from his eyes, and he did nothing to stop them. "I'm obliged to you for this news, Matron Molly." "I am so sorry, James." Tears pouring down his cheeks, Surgeon Lane amputated a left forearm, a foot, then a right arm at the shoulder. The next litter bore a Federal lieutenant. After his shirt was cut away, a bulge was apparent above the collarbone, perhaps a mini ball under the flesh or a canister ball. The lieutenant's eyes rolled in terror. Surgeon Lane dropped his knife in the filthy bucket of surgical appliances and rubbed a bloody forearm across his eyes. "Take this man to Surgeon Chambliss," he ordered. "I will not operate on this officer nor any other Federal soldier tonight. I cannot promise I will not do them harm." At noon the next day, Surgeon Lane lay down for an hour in the room Sally had made over for her own use. At 5 that evening, Surgeon Lane lost patience with a convalescent who had failed to empty the limb tub, so an arm rolled under the surgeon's feet and he misstepped, slashing his patient's thigh. "We are worse than our enemies," he shouted. "We're better killers through carelessness than they are intentionally." Cousin Molly Semple brought a hand basin of clean water. "Wait, wash up, James," she said. "I have a meal for you outdoors. It's time you came away." In the December evening, surgeons and matrons ate wordlessly at a makeshift table beside the low shapes of men who awaited their ministrations. Their living breath rose from where they lay. Now I'm going to read any more than that. But I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
You didn't even tell us that Sally was the one that was arrested.
Yeah. Well, she got pardoned. They pardoned a lot of people in those days. They weren't so. They weren't of the let's put them in jail for life school. They were pretty much the minute they show any repentance, let's get them out of here, get them out of the state's hands. A lot of the male prisoners were pardoned just to go into the Army, in fact. But I didn't think it would be too far a stretch to have Sally go into become a matron. It wasn't a job most women wanted. A lot of the women tried it for a little bit, and it was just too horrible. Because indeed, most of these fellows did die, and a lot of them, the South being such a close-knit place, were relatives or kinfolks of their friends. And that was, I mean, it took a woman of great stamina to do it. But probably a lot of the writing we have from women during the war that survived, some of the most interesting is from these matrons in the hospitals. They're good memoirs and stories about it.
How many male nurses were there? Because Walt Whitman was a nurse, wasn't he?
Yeah, well, I think he was probably what do you want to say, an aide. Yeah, in fact, a lot of the carrying out the bedpans and emptying the limb tubs were done by the convalescents, at least in the Confederates. And some of them stayed as long as they could, and then Lee would send his provosts around, and if somebody looked pretty healthy to the provost, they'd back into the Army. The Confederacy was the Confederate Army was in desperate need of people, much more so than the Union Army. And the chaplains, for instance, who attended the hospitals tended to be the chaplains that were a little too frail to serve with the Army. Yes, sir.
Were there any models or inspirations for any other characters like Marguerite or Alexander Kirkpatrick who sort of fascinated me? I can never quite figure him out.
Well, I couldn't either. I couldn't either very much. It's a little hard. I've never been very interested in the notion that there are psychopaths or that there are monsters. I think that the wickedest people I've ever met, that seemed to me to be pretty much like me, that had taken a couple steps where I didn't take. And so, I also am not very interested in the concept of evil that's unlike us. That seems to me to be an uninteresting kind of evil. The evil I'm scared of is the evil that's in me, that I'm capable of doing. So I guess Alexander, who doesn't turn out very well in this book, is probably in some ways the wickedest fellow there, but he's also a fellow that in an ordinary time, he would have been the sort of tiresome fellow that you avoid at parties. That probably would have been about as wicked as he ever got, just been boring. But given the terrible stress of the war, he changed, and not for the better.
Yeah. Well, Alexander intrigued me too, and my feeling certainly was that for some reason, now he's totally a figment of your imagination, right?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
So you want to know that. For some reason, his character began deteriorating.
Yeah.
Instead of improving. I mean, the war brought out the best in a number of people and made them exceed themselves, as it were. In other words, get better, become better characters. And he was
went the other way, yeah.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, and some of that was just bad luck. I mean, it seems to me that...
He became weaker and weaker.
Yeah. Let me read a section of that, because since we're talking about it, and some of you know nothing about Alexander, this is a dialogue between Alexander, who was at this battle, but basically fell into a briar patch and ran. And this is between the two of them are, when they went to the rear, they carried the wounded with them often, and these two men, one is a Tennessee mountaineer who's also in the retreat, and Alexander have this wounded boy with him who was very badly wounded. "Oh, there wasn't anybody more gallant than us," the wounded boy chattered. "Didn't we plague those Yankees? They were searching for us with their long arm. That's what we call artillery, you know, the long arm, and we'd shift position while they were hitting the place we'd been, and Major Pelham, oh, he was jigging like a wooden puppet on a string. I couldn't help laughing looking at him. It was the grandest fun I ever had." "You shot?" the mountaineer asked Alexander. "I don't know," he answered truthfully. I wish I could see my dear Mama's face one more time, the boy said. I have a letter for Mama in my pocket. Will you see she gets it? No need for that, son. We'll get you to the field hospital, and they'll patch you up, and you can give your ma your letter yourself. This war is over for you, son, don't you know it? My sister Clara, she's to be married next month, the boy said, and sagged. He became dead weight. They laid the boy beside the road, and the mountaineer pressed his thumbs over his eyes and took the blood-stained letter. He'll fight no more, the mountaineer said. I never wanted to be in the artillery. Every time you get in a scrap, the artillery horses get killed. Me, I never could abide that. Poor beasts never asked for war, nary one horse ever signed up to go to war. How they scream when they're hit. Many nights after a battle, I stayed awake on account of their screaming. Where are you from, soldier? Alexander had to think. Over in the mountains. Powerful lot of mountains in the Confederacy. Western Virginia, to the west of Stanton. Wasn't General Jackson born in that country? I wouldn't know. Sorry. Alexander stretched. Relieved of the weight of the dying boy, his body was light and free. His side was covered in gore. The boy's blood had matted his hair and plugged his ear, and his skin tautened it as it dried. I'm Maxwell, Pine Bluff, Tennessee. After they did for Gregg's Carolinians, they snuck behind our position and poured it to us. We never had no chance at all. Oh, we'll take a ribbing for that tomorrow. But we're going to the rear. Sure we are, sure we are. Don't go thinking we'll be staying. Provost man will send us back. We're whipped now, but we won't be whipped tomorrow. I'm whipped for good. If you ain't killed, you can fight again, and maybe this time it'll be you doing the whipping. How are you called? Alexander Kirkpatrick. I knew an Alexander once. Smallpox killed him. Only Alexander I ever knew personal. Of course, there's Alexanders aplenty, but he's the only one I knew. My mother hoped I would conquer all. Alexander chuckled. Way you talk, you're educated. Me, I never got educated. All my life I worked in the fields. Oh, I'd kill a deer or a bear to keep us through the cold months, but mostly I lived by the sweat of my brow, like the Bible says. When this war started, I thought I'd see the world, and by God, I have. I've been to Vicksburg till we shot out of there, and I've been to Maryland, and before it's over, I expect I'll get to Richmond. We passed through Richmond on the railroad, but it was night, and I couldn't see a blessed thing. How'd you come to be a soldier? It was no choice of mine. Conscript, huh? We ain't separated from the Union because we wouldn't be told what to do, and now our Confederate government goes to conscripting soldiers who never asked for any point in the fight. Conscripted man ain't any better off than artillery horses, and I said so many a time. Full indeed is the earth of woes, and full the sea. That from the Bible? Hesiod, one of the ancients. I never did know anything about those fellows. I can write my name, but schoolmaster quit, and there never was another come to my part of the country. I always believed I'd been luckier had I got my education. Folks got respect for a man with education. I am expected to know what I do not know. How I wish I could be just like everyone else. The rough Tennessean shook his head. Damned if that ain't something. Get shot at all morning, in the afternoon meet a man who says, I'm better off ignorant. The column limped through a road cut, and the sound of battle was swallowed by the shuffle of feet, the moan of wounded men, a man quietly begging to be killed. You got a wife? The mountaineer asked. No, I thought I had one, but I did not. She take up with somebody else, die on you? When my Sally wanted me, she didn't hesitate a moment, and when she was finished with me, she discarded me without regret. Hark, that poor fellow on the roadside. Some women will be weeping for him, I'll wager. Sally, she never showed any pity for me. I suppose I'm blessed. My wife's so homely, nobody else would lie with her. I ain't much, maybe, but I'm what she's got. My Sally was beautiful. Them beautiful women got the upper hand over us ordinary fellows. They can do better than us, and they know it. A homely woman like my Alice is grateful for what she's got. Never seen no homely woman running off. Do you care for her? The man shot him a strange look. Of course I do, of course I do. It's just my manner of talking. I didn't know what to say when you told how your wife had left you, so I said the first thing came into my head. That's where education comes in. Educated man never says the first thing comes into his head. Often he doesn't know what to say. That's when you can say what some other educated fellow said already. You got it memorized what the other fellow said and can use it for your own. So, that's Alexander anyway. Yes, ma'am.
Would you say something about the title, Jacob's Ladder?
Jacob's Ladder, yeah. For those of you who read the book, there's a real obvious connection. But the other thing that was in there were a lot of reasons to use it. One was that the song was one of these wonderful, it was a Methodist hymn originally that was then taken over by black slaves, turned into a spiritual, and then returned to the Protestant churches, where it still exists today, which is kind of an interesting musical change. But the other thing is the original biblical story about Jacob's Ladder is a story of promise and hope. And it's a little hard to think of now with the benefits of hindsight, but it was a time in Southern history of tremendous hope. The Confederates really wanted to form a new nation. They were very hopeful about this, and they were willing to do anything to make that happen. And on the other hand, their slaves were hopeful of freedom. It was an interesting kind of thing, but at the time, and right after the war, and during the war and right after the war, an awful lot of the Southerners were really quite startled that their slaves ran off and wanted to be free. They thought everything was, I'm serious, they really did. They thought everything was okay. And they were amazed. What do you mean? You know, Rufus wants freedom? What an odd idea. You know? Why would he want that? He's perfectly okay with us. You know, he's got a nice place to stay, or not too bad, and he gets food, and we don't overwork him, and we take care of him as long as he lives. What would he want to be free for? But of course they did. And they did during the war. At first, the North really didn't know what to do with the slaves that had run away. And they ran away in tremendous numbers. And a lot of them ended up here in Washington City, as a matter of fact. And what they did was, at first they just sent them back because it was still illegal to harbor runaway slaves. But then one military commander had the bright idea, look, this is enemy property here. And so they started calling them contrabands. And as soon as they figured out that particular terminological thing, these runaway slaves came to Washington in great numbers. And the United States colored troops, an awful lot of those regiments came right out of here and came out of Maryland and from Norfolk, pretty much wherever the federal troops held sway. And unlike white troops at the time, they knew perfectly well that if they were captured, they were going to be pretty lucky to survive. They were often just simply murdered. And if they weren't, they had been told explicitly that Jefferson Davis said any black troops, any colored troops coming at us, we'll sell them back into slavery. And indeed they did that too. And yet they signed on by literally the tens of thousands. By the end of the war, there were 172,000 United States colored troops because they had a real vision of what the future was. They really had a tremendous and wonderful hope.
How much of the 6 years did you spend researching it? How much did you spend writing it?
Oh,
Did you do it simultaneously? Or?
Yeah, kind of. The biggest problem I had, and it was almost insuperable. I came at this. I was raised in Montana and lived in the north. I'm a Virginian now. I've lived in the mountains of Virginia for 25 years. But I really couldn't understand why in the world they had done it. I mean, in a practical sense, it didn't make any sense. The North grew more tobacco than they did. The North had 8 times as many horses, 18 times as much railroad track, plus all the industrial base, plus all the Navy, plus on and on and on. And I couldn't imagine my way into it, and it took a long time to do that. And then one day, as I say, we've lived in rural Virginia now for 25 years, and it's my home, and my neighbors are my most important friends. And I was looking at them one day. We're having this kind of beer party down by the river, and it was sort of like seeing ghosts, because I realized that if this was 1861, the same people, my neighbors, would be going off to fight with Robert E. Lee. And then I realized, well, so would I. And so I could make, then I could make the leap of sympathy that was required to see this, because this is altogether a Southern book. I mean, to be sure, some Southerners, the blacks, end up fighting the other Southerners, but it's a story of Virginians during the war. I generally, when I would go to a battlefield, I would not stand on the side where the federal troops had fought, because that wasn't the story. Not because they weren't as gallant and courageous and splendid as the Confederates, but because that wasn't the story I was trying to tell. Yes, sir.
Your description of the hospital scene is more vivid and real than many of the battle scenes. In other words, as far as the horrible outcome, and yet so much of the video and movies and whatever seems to concentrate on the battle scenes.
Well, one of the ways, as a writer, I mean, one of the ways that people solve this problem is they say, oh, well, all these battles sort of took place in the minds of half a dozen generals. You know, 3 Confederates, three Union generals, and you got a book. Well, the problem with that is that it really didn't. It was a cultural war in lots of ways. And what was really important was what the private soldiers thought, and the people who tended them, and the teamsters who delivered their food, and the people who were growing their food back at home. And I mean, one of the things that happened was that essentially all of the males either went to war, or in the case of Abel, an awful lot of the black slaves ran away. And so what you had throughout much of Virginia was a culture of women and old men and children who were supplying, still producing food, not only for themselves but for the army. And that's a little harder to write about, in part because there's no, the people who were trying to manage these plantations often their letters didn't survive. You want to know what a general was thinking on a particular day, he'll probably tell you. You can find it in a report. You want to know what that general's wife was dealing with that day, you got to do a little ferreting out, So, yes.
It seemed to me that Jesse's story does not end in this book.
No.
And I'm
There are a
wondering,
couple of stories, don't you? A couple of stories, didn't there?
I'm wondering whether you're apt to do any more writing about it.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I'm going to... funny you should ask. Yeah. I'm going to be pestering the people at the Library of Congress here very shortly again. Yeah, Norton wanted a sequel. As a matter of fact, they said, it was kind of funny because they'd sent it out for a paperback auction, and they calls me up and they said, you've got to have a sequel to this, otherwise you're not getting any bids. The paperback people want to have nice bids, a nice sequel so that they can bid more money. I said, okay. I said, sure. They all go out west and do reconstruction, all this stuff. And 2 weeks later, my agent called me up kind of puzzled, and he said, they sent me the contract for your proposal. I said, what proposal? I have to say, it took less words than any proposal I've ever made in my life. So yeah, there'll be another one.
How far do you take the story in the book?
It's pretty much the framework is end of the 20th century, but the actual story, almost all of it, starts right before the war and ends at the end of the war. The principal narrator, you get to know a little bit more about her life than about the others, but it's pretty much contained. Yes, ma'am.
Did you do most of your research at the Library of Congress?
Did a lot of it there. Did a lot. It was, I wanted to go to all of the battles that the people fought even the ones I didn't write about. So I did that. Probably the most useful material I found were the letters that were written that day, because they often weren't, well, a simple for instance is, most of us today think of Gettysburg as being, quote, the high water mark of the Confederacy, and that's where the whole war ended for all practical. Everything after that was just kind of an aftermath. Well, the people at the time didn't think so. At first, the Confederates thought they'd won it. At least at home they thought that. And then when they found out the death toll, that's what they were horrified by, was how many generals had been killed, who were, among other things, the most promising men in the South. And then they looked at it as a really unfortunate defeat, but they were all ready to go. Every spring of the year, the Federals would send them an army out of Washington with banners flying, and generally within a couple of months, they'd come back into Washington, just beat to hell, and that's what the Confederates thought was going to happen when Grant took over too. Grant, on the other hand, was very used to victories, and he thought he was just going to run right over them. So that last part of the war was the bloodiest and probably least at least well known. I mean, for the last 8 months of the war were trench warfare, very much like World War I. And at one point, in fact, Grant's army was being supplied from City Point, which is a port on the James, and at one time it was the second busiest port in the world. It would unload 200 ships a day for that one army. And he built railroads from the port to his front lines. There were 18 miles of railroads, and his troops were getting bread fresh and hot from the ovens, and on the other side of the trenches, the Confederates were starving to death. It was a pretty amazing time. Yes, sir.
Would you go back and say how you got from sheepdogs to Civil War?
Well, see, it's one of the real nice things about being a writer. There's a lot of things that aren't nice about it, but one of the things that's nice is that if I can convince a publisher that something I've suddenly become curious about will interest anybody else in the world, then I can satisfy my curiosity. I think the motor for this book, this took me longer than any other book I ever wrote in my life, and I have to say that I certainly hope I never do it again. I mean, 6 years is too long to spend on a book, and it just was too much work. But I wondered because, one of the things I know anyway, is start one of these things, and after I've been at it for 6 months or a year, I will become convinced one dark night that this was the dumbest idea I ever had in my life, I mean, I know I'm going to have that moment. And then comes the question, get up the next morning, go back to work, or just quit. And I think that, one of the things about the Confederates was that they were an agricultural people. They were, for the most part, a rural agricultural people. And that's a kind of world that I've lived in. I mean, we have a sheep farm, and we have sheepdogs and all this kind of stuff, but that's the world that is my daily world of, feeding, taking care of livestock and making hay and all this kind of stuff. So there was a way in which I had kind of an advantage over other writers that maybe a little closer to that life than others. But I think that the real motor was just trying to understand my neighbors and the place I live. So I guess that's a long answer to a short question.
The court case was...
Yeah, that was the thing that started.
Was that the trigger that started it?
Yeah, it really puzzled me. I didn't understand it.
How did you happen to come upon that?
Well, I was researching for another book that I did called American Home Place, which is a history of my farm, and the best research material for that was the wills and deeds and land transfers in the courthouse. So I was rummaging through everything, trying to find records of people that didn't leave many records. Yes, ma'am.
I'm looking forward to reading this book. I just wanted to say I've loved your earlier books, especially Knott's Trials, and I hope Gail is fine.
We lost Gail.
I love this story.
Yeah. We have 4 of her offspring, however, including. Yes. Yeah. Oh, that's right. You've seen Dottie. Well, Dottie sends her best. She's funny. The Discovery Channel came down, and she is the official submissive dog. She goes around and she licks the other dogs' muzzles, and the Discovery Channel wanted to do a piece on the dogs, and wanted this. They wanted straight. They want simple behavior. You can show a lot of simple behavior on television, and what they understood was here was submissive behavior. What they don't understand was that when her mother had her pelvis broken, all her other daughters ignored her, and their mother thought she was a dead cookie. She went back in the back of the closet, and she thought that was it for her. We had to carry her out, a couple times every day. But Dottie would come in every day and clean her up. So is this submissive behavior? Well, not quite. Yeah.
When you're doing that, you live those characters? I mean, do they...
Yeah, you get completely lost in it. I'm not sure that... there's a terrible story that I heard after this was over, and it was something that made me think that there's a real downside to this writing business. And it was, somebody told me that Balzac on his deathbed died calling out for his characters. I find that a little frightening, to tell you the truth. I find that very frightening, Yeah, you get, because I mean, all this stuff is unconscious in the sense in which, you know, I can set it up so that the story is told, but I don't have a real sense of me consciously doing it. I can't make certain decisions. I can't decide what happens to characters. They tell me at some point, you know, this is what I'm going to do, and see, this is really inconvenient. You know, I didn't know where you were only going to last halfway through the book. You know. Yeah.
When you start in the morning on a particular chapter, whatever, you may not know where you're going by the end of the day.
Oh, I write out elaborate plans, but that's just sort of the illusion of control that I like to have. You know, I mean, and the thing is, it is an illusion. The narrator of this book was quite a minor character when she started, and she just said, "I'm sorry, I'm the one who's going to tell this story," and I said, "Yes, ma'am." You know? Okay.
If anyone has one more question, or that may be it, reach the end of our allotted time.
That's the end of the allotted time. Okay. Thank you very much.
Mr. McCaig will sign books,
Sure.
and y'all come on up and do this. I allotted the time.
You allotted the time. That's good. Well, I was wondering who was in charge of our allotted time here. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's the fellow you have to talk to. Frail.
Donald McCaig is a regular commentator on National Public Radio's All Things Considered. His previous works include several books about life in the country. The work he discussed today, Jacob's Ladder, is published by W.W. Norton and Company. You can reach the publisher at www.wwnorton.com. The author's email address is mccaig@va.tds.net. Teachers can find a guide to using today's program with Donald McCaig in the classroom by clicking onto booktv.org and continue